Good day, senior high icons. Welcome to ICI AP My E-Class. I'm Mr. Aldrin G. Sikitin, a faculty of Immaculate Conception Polytechnic Senior High School under the General Academic Strand. This semester, I will be handling English 400 or 21st century literature from the Philippines and the world.
Okay, good day everyone. So we're about to discuss another topic. But before that, let me present to you the objectives of this lesson. So at the end of this lesson, or at the end of the discussion, we are about to define speculative fiction, or we're going to define speculative fiction. Also, we're going to discuss some of the popular subgenres of speculative fiction. So we have several subgenres, about 5 to 6 subgenres. Also, we're going to somehow focus on the subgenre dystopian fiction. We're going to explain the characteristic of this subgenre, and also you're going to watch and we're going to analyze a certain literary piece which is under the dystopian fiction. And lastly, we're going to explore the contemporary issues reflected in speculative fictions or fiction. Okay, so these are our objectives for this lesson. Okay, so let us start by somehow looking at the origin of this type of literary type or literary genre. So we're going to somehow look for the origin of the word speculative. Okay, so speculative or speculative fiction comes from the word speculate, which means to think about something or make guesses about it. So basically, you're going to imagine things based on a certain concept or situation. And the story or the literary piece that, or the ideas or concepts that you are thinking or guessing about is the finished product or the speculative fiction itself. Whatever concept it is, whatever storyline it is, if you're going to imagine or conceptualize based on a specific concept or situation, that would be a speculative fiction. Okay, so let us somehow define speculative fiction in a much more, or in a more defined way or characterized way. So speculative fiction is a broad genre that encompasses stories that take place in an imaginary world as a result of one or more what-if questions. So basically, this is under prose fiction, wherein the writer uses imaginary character, imaginary situation, imaginary plot, wherein the basis of those stories are the question, or is the question, what if? Okay, what if this situation happens? What if we have this kind of technology and we could travel through time? We could go to the future or go back to the past. So those are examples of situations wherein we're going to think of what will happen if. Ayan. So speculative fiction includes genres such as science fiction, fantasy, supernatural fiction, utopian and dystopian fiction, apocalyptic and postapocalyptic fiction, alternate history, and parallel universe. So those are somehow types or subgenres of speculative fiction. Each one of them answers the question, what if? Okay, so we're going to discuss them one by one. So we're going to start with the subgenre science fiction, or also known as sci-fi. So science fiction deals mainly with the impact of actual or imagined science upon society or individual. So what if we have an advanced technology wherein we could travel time, or we could travel through time, or what else? We could invent some devices or weapons that would help us make life easier. Ayan. So those are examples of science fiction. Also, what if aliens exist? Okay, what if there are living things outside the world or in other planets? What would happen to human race if that situation occurs? Okay, so those are some examples of situation under science fiction. So examples of this subgenre are Frankenstein. So what if we could make a person or a dead person alive again, or bring back to life a dead person? So that's Frankenstein is an example of that. A Wrinkle in Time is an example of time traveling by the use of advanced science and technology. We also have 20,000 League Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Another piece from Jules Verne is Journey to the Center of the Earth. Ayan, if you're familiar with that. Also, we have Planet of the Apes, or Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. We also have Jurassic Park, wherein we brought back dinosaurs by the use of advanced technology and advanced sciences. Ayan, so nabuhay muli. So doon naman po, kung familiar kayo dun sa movie, we have several sequels of this piece. Ayan, so paano kapag nabuhay yung mga dinosaurs sa panahon kung saan nadodominate na ng tao yung mundo? Ayan. So, paano or ano kaya yung mangyayari sa civilization natin? Ayan. So, ganun yung concept behind science fiction. What if we have this kind of advanced sciences and then we could do this and do that? Ayan. So, what will happen? Ayan. So, basically, ganun yung concept na umiikot kay science fiction. Another example is Avatar. What else? We also have Jimmy Neutron, Phineas and Ferbs, and so on and so forth. Doraemon is an example of science fiction. Ayan po. And then next we have, ayan. So I know you're familiar with Harry Potter, and Peter Pan. Ayan. So Harry Potter and Peter Pan are examples of fantasy. So, fantasy uses magic and supernatural elements in plot, theme, and setting. And also, magic is the central theme or central idea to the fantasy genre. Ayan, so, in this type of speculative fiction, we have, or you will encounter magical powers, what else? Witchcraft and wizardry. You will encounter fairies and supernatural beings which are adorable in characteristics. And examples of fantasy are the following. We have Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. We also have Peter Pan and Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. So the sequel or the series of Harry Potter. What else? We also have the traditional fairy tales like Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, what else? Aladdin, um, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty. So those are examples of fantasy. Okay? Since fantasy is a quite broad subgenre of speculative fiction, in the modern days, it is divided into several types or categories. Ayan. And we have the categories of modern fantasy. The first one is personified animals. So in this kind of fantasy, characters are animals that talk and behave like humans. So basically, we have animals as our characters, but the way they dress, the way they act, and the way they talk, they're like human beings. So that is the characteristic of a personified animals under modern fantasy. So examples of these are Babe, Pig in the City, what else? If you're familiar with Zootopia, the animated movie wherein our characters are animals. We also have Peter Rabbit. So somehow that's a personified animals because the major characters are animals. Okay? And then, what else? I think those are Wonder Pets. Ayan. Example din po ng personified animals is Wonder Pets. Ayan. So, characters natin ay animals. And then, we have personified toys. Ayan. So, somehow the same ng similar with personified animals. The only difference is that in personified toys, our characters are toys or inanimate objects. What if toys have life? Ayan. So, what if they can talk, behave, act like human beings? Ayan. So, yun po yung personified toys. Siguro po yung pinaka-familiar na dito na pambatang show sa TV ay yung Dr. McStuffy. Ayan. So, wherein yung characters natin ay mga laruan. And then, another example is Night at the Museum. Ayan. So, kay Night at the Museum naman po, artifacts or yung mga bagay dun sa museum yung nabubuhay or kumikilos at nagsasalita na parang tao. So, those are some examples of personified toys. And then, the third one is outlandish characters and situations. So, outlandish characters and situations are stories that are realistic but contain characters that behave in outrageous, highly exaggerated ways that are utterly impossible. So, in this kind of fantasy or in this kind of story, yung situation natin or yung plot or yung setting natin ay in a real world or totoong buhay or ano ba, nasa totoong mundo yung ating setup. But yung character natin or yung situations na involved doon sa ating story ay medyo exaggerated or parang hindi yun yung action na ginagawa ng isang normal na tao. Ayan. So, example ko nga po dito, makikita sa presentation, we have Mr. Bean. Ayan. So, makikita nyo naman po dun sa story or dun sa shows ni Mr. Bean na yung actions niya ay hindi ginagawa ng isang normal na tao. Another example is movies of Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee, and Jet Li. Ayan. So, siguro po yung kanilang abilities ay hindi katulad ng isang normal na tao. And then we also have the Ong Bak, kung familiar po kayo dun sa movie na yun. Ayan. So, yun yung examples natin ng outlandish characters and situation. And then also, we have Home Alone. Ayan. So, yung story na kung saan yung bata ay naiwan sa kanyang bahay. Or naiwan siyang mag-isa dun sa bahay. And then, sinusubukan niyang ma-prevent yung um, pagpasok ng mga masasamang tao doon sa kanyang bahay. So, kung titingnan nyo po, yung ability ng bata ay parang hindi naman talaga yung kayang gawin ng isang normal na bata. Ayan. So, ganun po yung outlandish characters and situations. Ayan. So, normal or realistic yung ating setup, yung ating setting, but yung characters natin ay medyo abnormal, ayan, or exaggerated yung kanilang mga movements, yung actions, yung abilities nila. Ayan. The fourth one is the magical powers. So, parang ito na yung direct descendant ni fantasy, wherein yung stories natin, we have the character, world, or items which have magical powers. Ayan. So, meron na tayong powers. Ayan. One great example na po nito yung Harry Potter. If you're familiar with Enchanted, ayan, wherein yung princess natin ay napunta sa totoong mundo, but she has this magical power. Ano pa ba? Yun, yung mga stories na involve yung magic, and then involve yung mga creatures na somehow adorable, magandang tingnan, nakaka-enjoy panoorin. Ayan. So, yung Lord of the Rings, minsan kasi nag-overlap yung mga stories, yung characteristics ng stories. Kaya kung mapapansin nyo po, later on, meron ako mga stories na mababanggit dito sa genre na to, and then mababanggit ko ulit dun sa another type. Ayan. So, for example, Chronicles of Narnia, it involves magic. And then, I will going to mention Narnia again in another type or another subgenre. Ayan. So, basta, natatandaan nyo lang po kay magical power, direct descendant siya ng fantasy. Kasi nandyan yung magic. Okay? And then, next, we have embellished fairy tales. Ayan. So, fairy tales that have been embellished to include more character development, description of setting, and fuller story. It often attempts to answer questions that were provoked from the original or traditional fairy tale and shows different perspective. So, embellished fairy tale are stories that presents another side of a traditional and existing fairy tale. So, for example, in the Philippine movie and TV shows, we have the story, or we have the show Grazilda, starred by or portrayed by Glyza de Castro. Ayan. So, kung familiar, medyo matagal na po siyang naipalabas. That's early 2000s. Ayan. So, kung familiar po kayo kay Grazilda, siya po ay step-sister ni Cinderella. Ayan. So, Grazilda presents the story of Cinderella's stepsister. Ano nga ba yung nangyari doon sa mga stepsisters niya after nung happily ever after? Ayan. So, ganun po yung embellished fairy tale. Ayan. So, pinapresent niya po yung another side nung story para magkaroon po tayo ng mas magandang character development, mas makita natin kung ano yung nangyari doon sa story after nung main story. Ayan. So, another example is Maleficent. And example po siya ng embellished fairy tale. Kasi po, it presents the life or the story of Maleficent herself. Okay? So, ano nga ba? Bakit nga ba ginawa yun ni Wicked Wicked Witch? Okay? Wicked Witch kasi yung tawag. Ayan, bakit nga ba ginawa yun ni Maleficent kay Aurora or kay Sleeping Beauty? Ayan, so, ayun. So, ganun po yung embellished fairy tale. Ano pa bang example nito? Maleficent na saka kasi Grazilda yung pinakamagandang example ng embellished fairy tale. So, for example, magkakaroon pa ng ibang side yung mga traditional or conventional fairy tales natin. magiging embellished fairy tale siya. So, example, we have Beauty, the retelling of the story Beauty and the Beast. Ayan. So, if magkakaroon pa nga ba ng bagong side yung Beauty and the Beast, ano yung mangyayari? So, ito yung kinalabasan nun. We also have Zelle. It's from the Rapunzel. And then, we have Ella Enchanted. Ayan. So, from the traditional fairy tales Cinderella. So, those are embellished fairy tales. And then, the sixth one is extraordinary worlds. So, in this kind of story, character from normal world enters an extraordinary world by some means. So, kung mapapansin niyo po yung images sa ating presentation, it presents the characters from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Ayan. So, siguro naman familiar po kayo doon. Ilang beses na siyang naipalabas. And then we also have Alice in Wonderland. Ayan. So, ang pinagkaiba po ni Extraordinary World sa ibang mga type ng fantasy ay dito po, normal yung ating character. Normal na tao. Wala siyang power, wala siyang kahit na anong ability. Normal na tao lang siya. But, this character or this person enters an extraordinary world. So, katulad po nung kay Alice and Wonderland, napunta siya dun sa Wonderland. Kay Charlie, napunta siya dun sa Chocolate Factory, which is somehow different dun sa ating existing world or real world. Okay? So, another example is The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. So, normal yung ating character na babae dun, but she enters an extraordinary world. Next, we have supernatural elements. So, supernatural elements contain supernatural beings. This kind of story are often scary. Yeah. So, ganito na lang po yung tandaan nyo. Kay magical powers, yung creatures o yung mga supernatural creatures doon ay adorable. Maganda sa paningin. So, magandang tingnan. Kaya supernatural elements, kabaliktaran nun. Okay? Nakakatakot. So, dito yung mga zombies, dito yung mga aswang, dito yung mga monsters. Ayan, dito yun kay supernatural elements. So, example, we have Goosebumps, yung series po ng Goosebumps. And then, we have The Fog Keeper. Ayan. So, basta yung characters, yung creatures dito nakakatakot. Ayan. So, siguro po yung Goosebumps, kung familiar kayo, ito yung lumalabas sa libro yung characters. Yan. Pag binuksan mo yung isang libro, lalabas doon yung characters at mapupunta siya sa tunay na mundo. Yan. So, ganun po yung supernatural elements. And then, the last category of modern fantasy is second to the last, and time slips. So, in this kind of fantasy, our characters travel through time. Ayan. Ang pinagkaiba naman po ni time slips kay science fiction na pwedeng mag-travel din sa time ay dito po, hindi tayo gumagamit ng time machine or advanced science or advanced technology. Dito, nagta-travel tayo through time by some means. For example, sa Superbook. Ayan. So, yung characters natin doon, nagta-travel siya through time with the help of a certain thing. Ayan. For example, the Bible. Ayan. Another example is ang mahiwagang baul. Ayan. So, nakakapag-travel yung ating character sa pamamagitan ng mahiwagang baul. Ayan. So, ganun po. Halimbawa, may isang pintuan na pwede silang gamitin and then paglabas nila ay another time or another era or another period of time. So, ganun po yung time slips. And then, ito, last na po talaga is high fantasy. So, high fantasy includes the categories of myth, fantasy, gothic fantasy, epic or heroic fantasy, and sword and sorcery fantasy. High fantasy is set in a secondary world. Hindi po siya sa Earth. Okay? Meron ibang mundo na involved. For example, the Asgard. Okay? The Olympus. Ayan. So, ganun po yung world na tinutukoy kay high fantasy. So, noble characters, archetypes, and elevated style are the characteristics of high fantasy, according to Teen, Zarsky, and Boyer in 1997. Ayan. So, according to them, high fantasy involves noble characters like the gods and goddesses. What else? Elevated style wherein hindi basta-basta yung lifestyle, yung setting, and then yung setup ng world ay hindi katulad ng setup doon sa mga stories na sa Earth nagaganap or sa Earth nangyayari. So, ganun yung example ng high fantasy. Kung familiar po or napanood nyo na po yung movie na Warcraft, example po siya ng high fantasy. And then, ano pa ba? Yung Thor Ragnarok is an example of high fantasy kasi po, hindi naman Earth yung setting nila. Ayan. So, siguro po kung halimbawa yung Greek gods and goddesses natin ay magkakaroon ng movie or ng sarili nilang storyline, mag-a-under po siya ng high fantasy. Ayan. So, yan po yung mga examples or types of modern fantasy. Since, again, fantasy is a broad subgenre of speculative fiction. Okay? Next, we have the subgenre utopian fiction. So, this type of speculative fiction presents a world that is ideally perfect in all aspects of society. So, walang problem na kinakaharap, walang corruption, or kung anumang major problem na nagaganap sa setting or sa storyline or sa plot ng utopian fiction. Ayan. So, examples are Ecotopia. Ayan po. I'm not that familiar with Ecotopia. And then we also have The Giver and The Magellanic Cloud by Stanislaw Lem. Okay, so again, kay utopian fiction po, the world is perfect. Yun yung concept na pinapalabas niya. What if the world is perfect? Ano ba yung takbo ng society? Ano ba yung pamumuhay ng mga tao? That's utopian fiction. Okay? And then, we have dystopian fiction. Ayan. So, kay dystopian fiction, meron siyang similarity with utopian fiction. So, dystopian fiction presents a futuristic, imagined world in which there is only an illusion of a perfect society. Kay utopian fiction, perfect yung world, perfect yung society, walang na-encounter na problem. But, on the other hand, kay dystopian fiction, pinapalabas lang natin na perfect yung society na ginagalawan ng mga character. Pero sa totoo, yung world na yon, yung society na yon ay kinokontrol or ino-oppress ng isang corporate, isang bureaucratic, technological, moral, or totalitarian way of life. Okay, merong kumokontrol, merong pumipigil doon sa mga characters, kaya nagmumukhang perfect yung society natin. That's dystopian fiction. Okay? Examples are V for Vendetta and Divergent. And so, wag po kayo mag-alala. I'm going to give we're going to focus on dystopian fiction on our next meeting. Okay, so specifically on Divergent. So again, utopian fiction, what if perfect yung society, paano yung way of living? Okay, dystopian fiction, what if kinontrol natin yung society by some means, at pagmumukhain nating perfect yung mundo, what will happen to the way of living of the characters? So, ganun po yung nangyayari dun sa dalawang subgenre of speculative fiction, utopian and dystopian fiction. Okay? And then next, we have apocalyptic fiction. So, it deals with the end of civilization either through nuclear war, plague, or some other general disaster. Basically, the concept is end of the world. Okay? That's apocalyptic fiction. What if the world will end? Anong mangyayari dun sa human race or human beings? Ayan. So, example is 2012. Ayan. So, medyo naging naging trend, naging usap-usapan yung movie na to because some says that 2012 is the end of the world, or the year where the world will end. So we also have the day after tomorrow and the Independence Day. So basically, apocalyptic fiction focuses on the story which portrays the end of civilization or the end of the world. Okay? So, kahit na ano pa mang means yung end of the world na yun, basta it will present that end. Okay? And then, another example is the fifth wave. Ayan. So, example din po siya ng apocalyptic fiction. And then, next we have post-apocalyptic fiction. So, this type of speculative fiction is set in a world or civilization after such disaster. The time frame may be after or sometime later when the existence of civilization before the catastrophe has been forgotten. So, kung si apocalyptic fiction ay nakafocus dun sa before and during the end of the world situation, si post-apocalyptic naman po ay nakafocus doon sa after noong end of the world situation na yan. Halimbawa, kung si 2012 ay may part 2 na magpapakita ng buhay ng mga characters after noong situation or after nung catastrophe, that story will fall under post-apocalyptic fiction. So example po nito ay The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, World War Z by Max Brooks, and Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. So another example of this is Peninsula. Ayan, so diba we have the story Train to Busan. So it somehow presents an end of civilization story. And then nabuhay yung characters natin sa dulo. So basically ang question, anong nangyari sa kanila after that? Ayan, and then we have the Peninsula Train to Busan 2, which presents the situation after the catastrophe. So, basically, Peninsula will fall under post-apocalyptic fiction. Again, post-apocalyptic fiction focuses on the situations before and during the end of the world event. And then, si post-apocalyptic naman po ay magpo-focus on the time after the end of the world event or after the time of the catastrophe. Okay? So, yan po yung difference nilang dalawa. And lastly, we have alternate history. So, alternate history is set in worlds in which one or more historical events unfold differently from how it did in reality. So, it is based on the idea that for every event that occurs or happened or decision made in our reality, there is another place, which is the parallel universe, where the event or decision turned out differently. So basically, parang we have the real world, the real earth, and then we have the another world wherein kung dito sa mundo na to, ikaw ay estudyante, doon sa isa pang mundo or doon sa tinatawag nating parallel universe, maybe baka hindi ka estudyante or baka hindi ako teacher or baka hindi ito yung ating mga ginagawa. So, ganun yung concept ng alternate history. So, for example, kung halimbawa dito sa mundo na to binatukan kita. So, maybe doon sa ibang mundo or doon sa tinatawag nating parallel universe, ako yung binabatukan mo. So, ganun yung concept ng alternate history. So, examples ng alternate history are Napoleon in America by Shannon Selin. We also have Age of Aztec by James Lovegrove, and then X-Men Days of Future Past. So, ang familiar lang po ako dito is dun sa X-Men. So, dito po kasi, somehow spoil ko na po kayo. No, dito po, it starts with the present time wherein yung X-Men ay may encounter yung Sentinels. And then they knew na hindi nila kayang tapatan yung Sentinel. So, ngayon po, yung X-Men, ang ginawa nila is bumalik sila sa past or pumunta sila dun sa isang world wherein hindi pa na-encounter ng X-Men or hindi pa na i-imbento yung Sentinel, and they will change the history. So, they will change the future, basically. Ayan. So, ganun yung mangyayari sa X-Men Days of Future Past. Another example is The Flash. Ayan. So, kay The Flash kasi, meron tayong tinatawag na Earth 1, Earth 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then, kung ano man yung ability ni Flash dito sa Earth, iba yung ability niya or iba yung powers niya basically doon sa ibang mga Earth. Or iba na yung timeline na sinusunod nung nandoon sa ibang mga Earth. So, ganun po yung alternate history. So, merong ibang mundo na kung saan, kung ano man yung ginagawa natin dito, sa ating mundo, meron siyang impact or meron siyang effect doon sa ibang mundo or sa counterpart ng ating mundo. So, those are examples of stories under alternate history. So, again, as I have said, in this lesson, we're going to focus on the subgenre dystopian fiction. But, I will cut the discussion here because we're going to continue the discussion on the next meeting. Okay? So, hindi muna po ako magbibigay ng quiz today or this week. Hindi muna din ako magbibigay ng activity. So, I just allotted this week for the discussion of speculative fiction since this is a quite long discussion. And next week, we're going to focus on dystopian fiction. Okay, so that's all for this week or for this lesson. Thank you and have a safe week, a safe day or